At the beginning of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, right before the two characters meet and begin their fling, Romeo is on his way to a party with some friends, and while they're all reveling, behaving badly, and just in general getting hyped up for where they're going, Romeo can't shake this ominous feeling that's keeping him from fully getting into the spirit of the night. He says,
"I fear too early, for my mind misgives. Some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. But he that hath the steerage of my course, direct my sail."
For those of you not totally familiar with the style of English Shakespeare is using here, it's basically Romeo doing his best Han Solo impression.
I got a bad feeling about this.
My mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars means that he feels like something bad, a consequence, is about to fall on him. He thinks it will start that night. It shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels. He's saying that this party he's going to is going to start some sort of chain reaction that will expire the term of a despised life closed in his breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. He feels very strongly that going to this party will be the first step in a course of events that will end up killing him. Spoiler alert. This is foreshadowing. It's an easy term to define if you just break it down into its word roots, the before shadow. It's the ominous shadow cast by certain events before they come to pass. Foreshadowing is what happens when an author or creator puts a clue in like the first parts of the story about what will happen later. It's a clue that they leave for the reader that can set us up for what will eventually happen, and it's fun to pay attention to these on rereadings or rewatchings. This could be shown through an event that seems unimportant at the time, but turns out to have big consequences later, or possibly through the ways characters think or worry or talk about a situation. The situation in Romeo and Juliet is a pretty explicit example of foreshadowing in the sense that the character just kind of comes right out and says something is about to go down, but it can show up in many different ways. In Homer's Odyssey, we have prophets and their reading of bird signs. Now, bird signs are when kind of old mystics would look at which kind of birds are flying overhead and predict events that happen in the future. And in the story, they look at the bird signs and they determine what's going to happen next, what's going to happen later in the story, when Odysseus is going to arrive home. That's another example of foreshadowing, blatant though it may be, but it can also be a little bit more subtle, even down to like the color a character is wearing. Pay attention to this in stories. You never know when you might get a clue about what will happen later. For instance, what does it imply when Rey puts on her pilot's helmet at the very beginning of The Force Awakens? Another example is when Peter Pan's shadow breaks into the darling's home before Peter does. In that story, the shadow literally does its own foreshadowing. Another great example is when Mary Shelley uses the appearance of Victor Frankenstein at the beginning of the novel as foreshadowing for what will happen later in that story. Victor tells most of the novel through flashback, but in its first 20 pages, we know what's going to become of him. That's explicit foreshadowing. They're hints that the author drops about what will happen later in the story. We see this all the time in movies and books, but it works especially well when we have one of the characters narrating the entire story. They're able to drop hints about what will happen later, and it keeps the reader filled with suspense as to how things will play out. His appearance at the beginning of the novel is a great example of this, but you'll see it play out through the way he tells the story and through dreams that he will have later on in the book. So be on the lookout for these at the beginning of stories when you start to read them. Do you feel an ominous shadow go before you in the first several pages? Perhaps these hints are more important than you think.